everybody, welcome to Skeleton Keys.
I'm Torri Yates-Orr.
And I'm John Bucher.
And we are here to unlock the mysteries of pop culture through history and myth.
Torri, today is the day.
Yes, it is.
I have been waiting for us to get to the mythology of the Queen Bee herself. And today we finally have made it to get to talk about the mythology of Beyonce.
Yes, Queen Bee.
Queen Bee. Is it me, or do you never meet someone who doesn't like Beyonce?
I don't trust them.
I don't trust them either. I feel like she is the universal presence in our world. She's the glue that holds it all together.
She's the fiber of our culture right now. Or you might meet somebody who doesn't like her, but they respect her.
Oh, they respect her.
Yeah, and that's all I ask for.
Yeah.
Even in a deity.
Oh, yeah. Right?
You know?
Well, I think you and I, we're both Beyonce fans. We both love Beyonce. But also, this was one of the easiest topics for us to come up with because we both immediately saw a specific mythological lens that Beyonce was embracing. And it is this mythological lens that I think very few people are familiar with.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things I'm most excited about today is not just exposing people to how Beyonce is a mythological figure, but exposing people to the mythological idea of Mami Wata. And on this podcast, we try and demonstrate modern archetypes and modern projections of mythological motifs and figures. And Beyonce is clearly the modern Mami Wata. Mm-hmm. So for people who maybe don't have any idea what we're talking about, can you fill us in a little bit on who Mami Wata was?
I think this would probably be more your side of it. But Mami Wata is a deity who is so complex and represents so much, especially in terms of femininity.
Yes.
And it can be the light, the dark, everything.
Yes.
Mami Wata represents.
Yes.
And especially, I think it's a kind of a sense of womanly is the way. I would never describe Mami Wata as a girlish figure.
Yes.
It's a very womanly sense of her, which I think Beyonce inhabits so well. That Mami Wata, that Oshun energy.
Yes.
That she inhabits, but also uses. She utilizes that.
Well, Beyonce is our modern projection of Oshun. And Oshun, I think, is a mythological figure that many people are not familiar with. Although I think when we begin to describe Oshun, a lot of people are familiar with her. They just didn't know who Oshun was. And Oshun is a mythological goddess that is associated with the African diaspora, but there are a lot of different suggestions about how far back this archetype of Oshun goes. Certainly, we have Mami Wata, which is Mother Water, that we see in the ancient African traditions, that is a water goddess that is able to flow through any area, but it's also associated, or Mami Wata is associated with femininity, with sexuality, with power. There are a number of different mythological images of Mami Wata where she's holding snakes, and snakes that move through water are often evidence of her power and her moving creatures through herself. Oshun is going to be more the image that comes out of the Mami Wata archetype into the African diaspora, especially in the West. But I think whether we're talking specifically about Mami Wata or Oshun, there are certain elements of this archetypal symbol that are reoccurring. And certainly the idea of water and the goddess of the water is one of those ideas, but also there's a specific image of Oshun where she is dressed as a sun goddess in yellow. And this is, I think, where we can specifically begin to connect this goddess with Beyonce. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
100%. I think Oshun is very much a goddess. She is usually shown in yellow. She is the goddess of the sweet waters, so rivers, lakes, But what's interesting about her as well is that Oshun knows how to wield her sexuality, but she also has a side that can be very vengeful and very angry.
Yes.
And there's so many stories of her laughing as she's rageful.
Yes.
It's this combination of these two things that should not be put together, but that are Oshun, that are this energy of fierce femininity.
Yeah.
And Beyonce channels that directly.
Yeah.
Even from the way Beyonce has looked for years, she's typically very golden, very yellow, very orange, like a glowing orb. She channels that Oshun energy all of the time.
Yes.
While at the same time, even her music, it shows her connection to her femininity, but can also show, especially with her Lemonade album, her rage at her husband, just like Oshun had with Shango.
Yes. And I think we have to early on here acknowledge that so often when we look at the manifestations of mythological figures in pop culture, we so often get stuck on the Greeks. And there's a lot to be had there. Don't get me wrong. I love Greek mythology. But I think this is a really important conversation to have. And that is that mythological figures existed long before the Greeks began to craft narratives.
Yeah, they're not the only ones
about them. Yeah, exactly. And knowing the rich African mythological traditions, you can't even loop all those in together. There are certain regional gods and goddesses that are more common in West Africa or in specific countries like Burkina Faso or Cote d'Ivoire or Guinea that you don't find in, say, East African traditions. So obviously, African mythology is such a large topic in and of itself, but we see Mami Wata in her various manifestations coming out of Africa and into these places where people who were enslaved were taken to. And so with Oshun, we specifically begin to see, especially after Europeans had begun to bring about influence on enslaved peoples, that we see mixes of different mythological traditions with Catholicism specifically.
The saints.
Yes, the saints. And this is where we get in Haiti and Jamaica and the Dominican Republic, we get a number of different specific religious traditions that are hybrids, if you will, or mixes of African folk traditions with Catholicism, with the local regional beliefs of Native and Indigenous people there. In some ways, this is one thing I love about Oshun is she seems to not be limited by a specific religious tradition or heritage or even local or regional figure. She's a goddess that transcends all of that, much like water transcends any sort of path or shape that we would put down to control it.
Yeah, she is. It's interesting in reading about Oshun how she changes depending on where she is in the diaspora.
Yeah.
Like she is the lady of the sweet water, but she might be more vengeful for this village here, or like we were talking about in terms of the hybrid of religions, especially in the Caribbean and Brazil, she is kind of taken into Catholicism as well. Yeah. But there's a recognizing of wanting her sweetness and her fierceness.
Yes.
And applying it even to these faiths that might not even be hers to begin with.
Yeah.
And how it changes throughout the diaspora.
Well, and she also embodies these ideas that many times we see as opposing forces. Oshun is both nurturing mother and sexy mama. She's both of these things at the same time. She's not reined in by our cultural expectations. She is a healer of the physical life through her sweet water that she brings, but she's also a healer of the spiritual and psychological life. She is the embodiment of danger, of desires, of risks, of challenges, of dreams, of aspirations. She is able to see both the past and the future. And the same way that a river has, in many ways, no beginning and no end, she is the mythical cycle embodied, all in one. Now, one of the unique discoveries that I think we have to point to in this episode is that while many of the modern projections of mythology that we talk about on this show are maybe unconscious or subconscious or things that we see, Beyonce is specifically channeling and pointing to Oshun in various ways. There's a particular image that we see in a Video Music Awards appearance that she made where she actually intentionally dresses like Oshun, and the entire performance is specifically directed towards people recognizing the power of Oshun.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
I was shocked when
Yeah.
I saw her do it
Yeah.
because I knew exactly what she was doing.
Yeah.
The performance is very much like a worship of Oshun through her.
Yeah.
And then especially in Lemonade, there's a part where she comes out in a yellow dress, opens the door, and water spills out.
Yeah.
And it's so Oshun. And then she proceeds to go through the neighborhood laughing and singing and busting in windows with rage.
Yeah.
She's the only person I think on this podcast who is intentionally doing it.
Yes.
And I think it might be for a variety of reasons, just like we were talking about in terms of it's not just Greek mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Beyonce has always been very vocal of being proud of her Blackness.
Yes. Yes.
And I think when she references Oshun, the majority of African Americans are descended from West Africa.
Right.
That was where our ancestors came from. I think it's a way for her to say, we have divinity too.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it's our divinity.
Yeah.
This is what this is. And I
Yeah.
think that was a part of her doing that. She could have been like, oh, I am the modern day Athena. That's not going to resonate as well
Yeah.
with African Americans.
Yeah.
That's our deity.
Yeah.
And that was her kind of connecting and being that conduit of like, let me show you the divinity of our past, my own divinity and your divinity.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. You bring up specifically Lemonade, which I think is one of the most important artistic works of our generation, but also a very mythological work in many ways. And you talked about specifically the visual of dressed in yellow and opening up and the water coming out. There's a specific song on Lemonade called Sandcastles. Mm-hmm. And Sandcastles, while it certainly works as a metaphor for the relationship, it also is, in my opinion, it's speaking directly to this Oshun archetype of the ability, the power of this woman to control the water that destroys the sandcastle. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I think what's interesting there is that Beyonce is speaking her own power in the way that gods and goddesses have done throughout history. Oftentimes in other traditions, we see very humble gods that other people talk about, and we say, oh, that god's very powerful. But in some traditions, the gods and goddesses themselves will tell you just how powerful they are.
And Oshun is that goddess.
And Oshun is that goddess. And so she's very much manifesting Oshun in Sandcastles when she's talking about, again, the ability of the water to destroy what was built, that she's not just a figure that is going to put up with whatever's been done to her, but she is a powerful figure that will destroy this house if need be. And the fact that she's using water metaphors in this song as well, it's not lost on me. What's also not lost on me is this album is called Lemonade, which is obviously a yellow water. Yeah. But it's also, lemonade is one of those really interesting drinks that is both sweet and bitter at the same time. Yeah. And we have talked quite a bit before, Torri, about the mythological importance of the opposites. Mm-hmm. And whether that be sun and moon or light and shadow, the opposing ideas of sweet and bitter are quite mythological. And Mami Wata's water can be the sweet water that brings life or the bitter water that poisons and brings death. Yeah. She's capable of both. I wonder, as a woman who hears this yourself and who thinks about these mythological ideas and historical ideas, why is it important that it come through pop music? Because it could come through literature, it could come through a variety of forms, but there's something I think that's significant about this coming through the siren song, if you will.
Yeah, 100%. I think what's interesting, I watched Lemonade for the first time by myself. I knew it was coming on. I'm like, okay, what is this? No one really knew what it was. Mm-hmm. And then the story of Lemonade is the story of so many Black women, of dealing with ancestral pain, of pain that has been passed down to you and how that manifests in your life now. And so when she did that and incorporated Oshun, to me, it was creating her own myth.
Yeah.
And a myth that all of us could relate to.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, that is a story that is repeated. We saw that. But we weren't going to see that if that was a book.
Yeah.
Beyonce inherently, like Oshun, understands her own power.
Yeah.
And is not afraid to use it. And so she knows everyone's going to watch this. What kind of story can I tell? It's my story, but it's also the story of so many Black women who have constantly put themselves into this to make things right, and they still get the bitter.
Yeah.
But let me show you that there's the sweet as well. And I think it was a love letter. To me, it felt like a love letter to Black women, to the stories that we've had to deal with, of a father who cheated on our mother and how that affects us and how we might repeat the same thing. It was an honoring of our ancestral lineage from even our mother and father all the way back to Oshun.
Yeah.
So it was extremely powerful to me to watch that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's powerful. There's something about the idea of ancestors that you mentioned that definitely connects to the idea of Oshun and Mami Wata that I think is also, it has an entirely different connotation in African mythologies and the African diaspora because you're dealing with people who have been forcibly moved from their home. I wonder when we look at a figure like Oshun, who is different than, say, a god like Anansi, who also has origins in West Africa, there's, I think, something significant to this being a goddess as opposed to a god. There is something comforting that is mothering about Oshun, but that at the same time doesn't lose her feminine sensual power at the same time. And I think this is something mythologically that people have struggled with throughout history is how do we hold the Madonna and the whore at the same time, the goddess and the woman of ill repute in the same time. And I think one of the things that is interesting about Oshun is that there's not a deep concern about reconciling those.
No, it's never thought of.
Right. Yeah.
It's never an issue.
Why do you feel like that? I feel like that is something that maybe African mythological traditions can carry in a way that other cultural traditions don't succeed at.
I think it's like what you're saying. It's just not even thought of.
Yeah.
It's never even thought of that I have to reconcile those two.
Yeah.
That's just who I am.
Right.
And I think, like we were talking, you see that in Sumerian. That messiness, that those two things that might seem completely different is never even thought of as a bad thing. It's only, I think, particularly Western culture that wants to divide, that wants to say it's either this or this.
Yeah.
I think ambiguity is more comfortable in Eastern religions, African religions, indigenous religions. They're more comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And so I think Oshun is an example of that.
Yeah.
Of she's like, this is who I am. It would never dawn on Oshun to take away her sexuality.
Yeah.
Or to take away her motherly side.
Yeah.
It would never even dawn on her.
Yeah.
She's like, this is what you want. Yeah. I am the whole woman.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something I think interesting about Oshun as a goddess where many of the Greek goddesses sort of represent one aspect of the feminine experience. Aphrodite represents this sexuality, this love piece. Hera represents wisdom, Artemis. We could go on, and it's really not to say that there's not nuances or subtleties, but often it seems to me that the Greeks divided the feminine and the masculine experience up into these sort of segmented characters. Yeah. And we don't see that with a character like Oshun. She embodies all of it.
Yeah.
There's something to me that's very healthy about that holistic approach, that holistic goddess that is all of it at the same time. Obviously, I'm not a woman, but in some ways I would think that would feel more relatable to what women do experience.
I think it's one of those things where if I was a woman who was worshiping goddesses, I could channel Aphrodite.
Yeah.
I could channel Artemis and be my wild self, but I could be Oshun.
Yeah.
Because Oshun's all of those things.
Yeah.
So I think it's a sense of there's a closeness to Oshun that can be reached for people because she is this amalgam of all these different things.
Yeah.
The gods of Olympus, and not that they don't have, like we were saying, not that they don't have nuance or color to them, but they are very segmented.
Yeah.
So it's more of like picking things off of a shelf. I want to try this. I want to try this.
Yeah.
Instead of a real being.
Yeah.
And I mean a whole being.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where Oshun, I think that's why she has spread so much through the diaspora.
Yeah.
Because it is a real being that you can picture.
Yeah.
And even in the creation story, they create the world and they're like, oh, Oshun, we don't need you. You're the only woman.
Yeah.
And she's like, okay, bet. They create civilization. They create people. And they're like, oh, this world it's not worth it.
Yeah.
It's no fun. There's no light. And then they're like, hey, did you talk to Oshun? And then she comes and brings that beauty, that light, the love, the thing that we need in the world, the thing that makes life worth living. She brings that.
Yeah.
But she brings it as a whole being, not as, I'm just going to bring love, guys. I'm just going to bring fertility.
Yeah.
She brings it all.
Yeah. But in you saying that, I'm reminded how often she is imagined with snakes, holding snakes. And snakes also have a really interesting...
They get a bad rap.
Yeah, mythological idea. I mean, the snake is, of course, in mythological symbolism, the Ouroboros represents the cyclical, but also the shedding of the skin and the death and rebirth that is the cycle that keeps happening again and again and again. And I think that's not lost on me, that image of Oshun holding the snake and the idea that Oshun in many ways is that figure of the constant reinvention, the constant death and resurrection and death and resurrection and death and resurrection. And she keeps reinventing herself in so many ways, which is a gift that many goddesses or gods don't give us. Mm-mm. That's a pretty unique, inspiring, psychological gift.
She gives you permission to be new, to die.
That's it.
And be reborn. She gives you the permission.
That's it. And maybe, I think you've nailed it with that word, permission. There's something to who Oshun is that really is about permission and that is about her making a way. And that's another thing water does. Water can clear a path.
Yep.
Water can clear a path where there seemed like there was no path. And it also, in a lot of mythology, water is symbolic of the unconscious. And I like connecting that to Oshun as well, that she is, in many ways, she's not bound by her conscious thought.
No.
Yeah. Well, speaking of being bound, it's time we come out of the closet, Torri. It's time.
Skeleton Key.
Skeleton Keys is about offering a skeleton key, and we offer a skeleton and a key every episode. So, Torri, what skeleton have you brought for us in this episode?
Well, since we're talking about Beyonce, I do have to admit that I did dress up as Beyonce for Halloween.
Nice!
A couple years ago. It was very much the crazy in love. So I had a horrible blonde wig and jean shorts and a tank top because I couldn't think of anything else. And I just went around going, uh-oh, to people. They weren't a fan of that, but I did it anyway.
You weren't going to be bound.
I won't be bound. Oshun gave me permission.
That's right.
So, not my best work. Fun fact, I'm not a pretty blonde. But yeah, if I find those pictures, I will share them. But that definitely should be a skeleton that I keep in my closet. What about you?
Well, I also have a Beyonce story. I once bought a ticket to go see Beyonce when she was with Destiny's Child. And I went with my friend, and this concert was at Six Flags over Texas. And again, this is way, way back in the day when Beyonce is a part of Destiny's Child. And we were talking about, we all sort of, he and I both had crushes on the various members of Destiny's Child. And he told me, he's like, Beyonce is the most beautiful of all of them, and she's going to be the one that is successful. And I disagreed.
Okay.
I did not see things the same way at the time. And I was pretty convinced that as great as Beyonce was, she was not going to be the most beautiful breakout of Destiny's Child. And maybe I should just hold it within my own secret
I think you gotta
heart
share it now.
of who I thought
I think you gotta share it now.
was going
You've already opened that door. Wait.
Yeah.
Which iteration of Destiny's Child was this? Was it the 3 or the 4?
This was the 3.
Okay.
This was the 3. Yeah.
He's blushing. You can't see it, but he's blushing.
Well, let me just go back a little further in this story. Is at the time there was another group out called In Vogue, and
Love In Vogue.
Yes, and so I had a huge crush on Dawn from In Vogue.
Classic, yes.
Yeah, classic, and I felt like that there was a member of Destiny's Child that looked a lot like Dawn from In Vogue, and so in my defense, it was Michelle. It was
There's
Michelle.
nothing wrong. Michelle gave you harmonies.
She did. Michelle was. Here's the thing. I still think Michelle is beautiful, and I still a fan of Michelle's. But I was wrong. I was wrong in that I didn't realize at the time that Beyonce would be the rising star out of the group. So I put my money on a different candidate to succeed from Destiny's Child. But that's okay.
Well, you're not alone. Okay. There was a newspaper article that said, Beyonce's great, but she's no Ashanti.
Oh, well.
So you were not alone in that thought.
Well, that could have been me at the time. I thought
that
Ashanti was pretty great at the time, too. So, but yeah, that's my skeleton key. As much as a fan I am of Beyonce now, she was not where I was at in the beginning. But I came to Jesus. I changed my ways. And
came to the side.
I did. So anyway, that's my skeleton for the week. I think we would be doing Beyonce a great disservice if we didn't talk a little bit about why our culture needs a Beyonce from a mythological perspective. Because in some ways, we can see a Beyonce as a goddess type figure that could fit into any of the Greek goddess molds. We could say, well, Beyonce has been an incredible businesswoman. She's got the wisdom of Hera. She, in some ways, has held a piece of sexuality for society that Aphrodite has held. She transcended those things, but there's something that we need as a culture and as a society that Beyonce, from a mythological perspective, offers. Any ideas what that might be?
I've tried thinking about this, about why when you say Beyonce, people kind of react differently. And I think Beyonce has built herself into a god. Has built herself into a deity.
Yeah.
Maybe not intentionally. I don't think she's like an egomaniac who's like, I need to be worshipped.
Yeah.
But I think she inherently understands worship.
Yeah.
So Beyonce is very measured in terms of how she presents herself. She's very in control. Anyone who's ever talked about Beyonce said she controls every single aspect down to the smallest light in her show. She doesn't really do interviews anymore.
Yeah.
Her social media are pictures that are staged that don't show her personal life.
Yeah.
She has cultivated a sense of mystery around herself. And I think I was reading some article and they were talking about Beyonce is kind of the last of the Princes, the Michael Jacksons, the Bruce Springsteen, these superstars who are kind of on another level that they seem kind of untouchable.
Yeah.
And she's done that for herself. She wasn't that in Destiny's Child. I saw Destiny's Child in concert and I was like, oh, she's good, but I wasn't thinking she's going to be the biggest star in the world. I think she understands there needs to be a goddess.
Yeah.
And she's kind of crafted her career in that way and crafted her image in that way.
Yeah.
And like you said, she possesses all of these things that these goddesses could have. But I think it's just that inherent sense of this bigger figure of something bigger.
Yeah.
That to attain, not even to attain to, but that exist.
Yeah.
She represents that to me.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I also think that there is something interesting from a goddess/god perspective about her relationship with Jay-Z. Because I think she obviously stands on her own as a goddess, that she's Oshun all by herself. Also, she has this relationship with the biggest name in hip hop and one of the biggest names in music of all time that has been a very public relationship. And I think it's a public relationship between two very private people. I can't help but think about different relationships between gods and goddesses that did their best to keep their business away from humans, and yet stories about them still become part of human culture. That, I think, is something that we cannot ignore, is that Beyonce, while she is this singular entity, she is also married to Jay-Z. She's also the sister of Solange. She's also former bandmates with Destiny's Child. She also is the daughter of someone who's been very vocal and outspoken in culture. So she's connected to all these other figures, just like sort of a family tree of Greek mythology, where we see these other figures that are important and have their own stories and have their own meaning within culture. And she's that too.
100%.
Yeah.
Do you think, I'm curious as to what you think, she and Jay-Z do this. They don't talk about their actual relationship unless it comes through their music. They control the narrative.
Yeah.
Do you think that's part of that too?
I do. I think in many ways that feels very mythological to me, that they just deliver the stories about their life through narrative. And we could look at Jay-Z as sort of an Orpheus type character, but I do think that the fact that they only seem to speak about their lives through their music and through metaphor, it only increases our fascination with them as sort of deity-like figures. Because in this age, we seem to be exposed to every aspect of celebrities' lives. They somehow have somewhat succeeded at keeping a large part of their life secret. Now, whenever something does spill out, there's some very famous elevator footage a couple of years ago where her sister got into it.
Solange is not the one you want to fight.
She is not the one you want to fight. And she began having it out with Jay-Z. I think we become perhaps more fascinated than we do in a normal situation to get to peek behind the curtain for just a minute and say, we're seeing the gods and goddesses at their most vulnerable at moments that they don't see. And I think in our culture, it's become harder and harder for people to sort of hold the archetype of god or goddess because we do see so much of their lives. And people put so much of their lives on social media that it ruins that illusion that they are deities. And we know they're not deities, but in many ways, they hold the same archetypal container that deities did throughout culture. There's a really interesting book that I read a number of years ago that was about, did the Greeks believe in their gods? Like, did they really believe that those gods existed, or were they characters and stories for them? And the book really explores that idea of, even if people don't believe in a literal manifestation of this god, how we still need these big, powerful figures that make the world make sense to us. And I think that's often what Beyonce and Jay-Z are these big mythological figures that help us make sense of the world. We need Beyonce to be this perfection.
Yep.
We need her to be the queen. We need her to be more than human. We need that.
Yeah.
And honestly, if she falls and is unable to live up to that, we find somebody else.
Exactly. It moves on to the next one.
Yeah.
She's just taken that position.
And it's a difficult position to hold for a long period.
I couldn't imagine the fact that she's held it for as long as she has.
Yeah.
Shows, one, the control that she has over her own image. But two, I mean, just as a human being, I can't imagine how exhausting that must be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, probably what her secret is she listens to this podcast, and we give a key every podcast to something that's helped us in life.
We just want to help you, Beyonce.
We just want to help you, Beyonce. We're here for you. We're here for you. So, hey, friends, if it's worked for Beyonce, it can work for you. Torri, what sort of skeleton key, what key do you have for the people this week?
My key would be the book Oshun Across the Waters, a Yoruba Goddess in Africa and the Americas by Joseph M. Murphy and Meme Sanford. And it's so good because it basically breaks down the differences in Oshun throughout the diaspora, which is really useful, from how she helped tribes in terms of like, let's get the market ready, you channel Oshun, to being this big deity. It was really helpful in kind of examining the breadth of who Oshun is. So I would highly recommend it to you and Beyonce.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Maybe Beyonce's already read it. Who knows?
Beyonce might have this on her nightstand right now.
Well, I don't, and I'm going to pick that up because
There you
that
go.
sounds amazing. That sounds so good. I too have a book. This one's a little saucy.
Ooh.
Yes. It's called The Mythology of Sex by Sarah Denning.
Hey.
Yeah, and it's an illustrated exploration of sexual customs and practices from ancient times to the present. And I've thought a lot about what Beyonce does hold for us in our culture and how she is this modern Oshun, this manifestation of Mami Wata. And I'm really fascinated at how there always seems to be a connection to sexuality in these big figures that hold. And it's probably because so much of our own experience as human beings, we're sexual creatures. And this is how we keep our species moving forward.
Exactly.
So it's good that we are interested in sexuality, but I'm interested in how that is played out throughout history and how sexuality has been viewed mythologically, how it's been exploited mythologically, and how we understand who we are as a result of our most intimate moments in culture. So highly recommend the book. It's got a lot of pictures in the book. So if you're someone who likes a lot of pictures in your mythology of sex books,
Who doesn't?
Who doesn't? Sarah Denning has got you covered. It's a great book, and I highly recommend it. It's been a key for my understanding many of these issues that we've talked about on this podcast. So before we wrap things up, Torri, let's talk a little bit about maybe how Beyonce has impacted us personally, kind of on a mythological level. For me, Beyonce, I've went and seen her a couple of times in concert, and in some ways, the way that she has designed her shows, it feels like visiting a temple of a goddess. And it's the experience of the sounds and the smells and the visuals. She literally creates an experience for her adherents to come and worship in many ways. And that has, as someone who has paid my temple fees to come and worship, I personally have been impacted by her as a mythological figure in a quite personal way. And because she does tell stories from her life that I relate to and I connect to, she feels like a personal goddess in a way that I think many of the goddesses felt very personal to people in various regions. A certain region would have a goddess that was their goddess. She was local to that region, and people felt like, oh, that's our deity. They're local to our region. And in some ways, it's not that Beyonce is always physically nearby, but she talks about things thematically in her narratives that makes her feel psychologically nearby.
Yes, that's exactly it. I think it's interesting, too, that you said that about that's our goddess. Is Beyonce's fans are notorious. They're called the Beehive.
Yeah.
They swarm.
Yeah.
If a word is said bad about Beyonce, they will find you. Like literally will find you. And I think Kid Rock had said something about her, and they just put bees on his Instagram for like a year. The people who are devoted to her are devoted to Beyonce. And I think it gives people a sense of worship that maybe they don't get in maybe their church or ever their space. And it's a sense of worship that anyone can kind of attain to, like anyone can get. I've always loved Beyonce because I think being a fan of hers from Destiny's Child, Beyonce to me has worked her way up to a goddess.
Yeah.
She was not necessarily a goddess in Destiny's Child, but she was a goddess. Then she was Queen Bee. Then she was King Bee. Yeah. And then now she's Beyonce. Yes. Just one word.
Yes.
And so in a way, her ascent to being a goddess is something that all of us can kind of attain.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. It seems so accessible.
Yes.
Because we're like, yeah, she worked her ass off to get to where she is.
Yeah.
And she comes from like Texas, you know, like we can relate to that. She obviously had a childhood where she was being trained for this.
Yeah.
But she wasn't born this.
Yeah.
She became a goddess. So there's something about the accessibility of that. Yeah. Of like, okay, she reached this level. I can reach that level.
Yeah.
I can do that. I can find that. So that's always why I think I will be that person who's like, Beyonce, Queen Bee. But I think that's part of it.
Yeah. Well, even if you can't reach out to Beyonce, you can reach out to us.
Yes,
and
people.
We would love to hear from you. Would love to hear how you're enjoying the show. Please go to iTunes and give us ratings. Give
5
us
stars.
5 stars, good comments. And if people do want to reach out to us, Torri, where can they find us?
Well, you can always shoot us an email at skeletonkeyspodcast@gmail.com, or you can follow us on the social medias at Skeleton Keys Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and our personal. Mine is on Twitter and Instagram is Torri Yates-Orr, TorriYatesOrr.
And I'm on Twitter at John, JOHNKBUCHER, and on Instagram at Telling a Better Story. We are so thrilled that you join us for this podcast. Thank you, thank you, thank you for listening. We'll see you again. This has been Skeleton Keys.